welcome to Contact. I'm Gloria Creighton, and with me today at Anderson's Restaurant is local researcher and historian Will Koop. Will, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And do you have a glass of water?
Yes, I do, and it seems to be pretty good.
Yeah. Will actually is currently researching the nature and history of our very precious watersheds. So it's apropos that we do have a glass of water on the table. And let's jump right in with that, Will, because that's foremost on most people's minds these days. Water for the children, water for life. What is the state of our water? Is it good, bad?
Well, recently there was a slide in the Capilano Reservoir. For the listeners or viewers right now who don't know very much about the watersheds, perhaps the Capilano is the western watershed. There's 3 of them, and there was a large slide that slipped into the Capilano Reservoir on October 9th. I believe it was a Monday, and it was estimated to be about 40,000 cubic meters, roughly speaking, which is about 5,000 truckloads. And initially, the Water District came out with a press release saying that the excessive turbidity, which caused the Capilano Reservoir to be closed down, was caused with rain falling on the sidewalls of the reservoir. And about a few days later, they came out with another press release saying there was a large slide in there. And so they had to close the reservoir down. It was very interesting because shortly after that, the chief engineer, John Morse, also the manager of water construction, had made a statement that the slide was not attributed to any kind of logging practices. And it's very interesting because I have been doing research in the area that there's probably some good reasons to suggest that there have been consequences from logging in the past to do with this. Now currently they're investigating all this, but...
Yes, and it goes on. There was a time, actually not too long ago, when it could be said that, and I felt this for years, that we had one of the best water supplies in the lower mainland in the whole world. And we can't say that nowadays, can we? Honestly?
Well, no, not now.
No.
Certainly the reputation of the quality of Greater Vancouver's water was renowned. According to some papers I came across, even Wellington, which is the big city in southern New Zealand, had known about this, and they had come up here and acknowledged that and gotten some information from the people here. But the watersheds were carefully preserved and protected prior to 1961. And that's a very interesting part of this history. And there's a couple eras from 1927 to 1961 when the watersheds were protected, and afterwards when the protection was lifted because of logging in the watersheds.
Now going back, Will, to I think it's this is reading from your material, from your research. I think it was 1918 to around 1930 there was a company logging in the watershed. The
Capilano Timber Company in the Capilano watershed.
Right.
What they had done is they had bought up leases, government leases from individuals, and they had bought these lands back in the early 1900s. But because of the state of the economy, they decided not to go ahead and log in this area and started logging in 1918. But prior to this time, there were concerns from all kinds of individuals about their proposals to log in the area. In fact, they wanted to buy out their timber rights. But because of political pressure or politicians not wanting to do this, because of the expenditures, the Capilano Timber Company started logging in the Capilano.
How long did they log for?
They started logging in 1918 and ended around the end of 1932.
Right, and actually we haven't learned from history because sources, experts of the day, to quote again from your documents, were in an uproar at the end of this. They had seen the damage that it had started to cause in the watersheds, and they decried it, and because of this it stopped. Now, why is this happening now? Haven't we learned from history?
Well, at the time, in the 1920s, and people really don't understand what happened in the 1920s. There was a great concern from individuals here, even MLAs, members of the provincial legislature, who were opposed to this. In fact, Charles Woodward, who was the member from Vancouver here, he was threatening to resign over an issue to do with logging in the watersheds at that time. In 1924, there was a very famous address, which I named my draft manuscript after, by John Davidson. He was a professor of botany, and he gave an address to a crowd of about 300 people in October of 1924, and he called it Wake Up Vancouver. It was a very appropriate title because the accelerated clear-cut logging that the Capilano Timber Company was doing in there. And he even said that, you know, there's a strong possibility that there could be a large fire because of what they're doing in there, which threatens the quality of the people's water supply. And indeed, in 1925, there was a very large fire started by them, which burnt about 3,200 acres, and burnt and smoldered for about 2 months. So, so there was a public outcry about logging, and it was because of that fire that the policy to protect the watersheds were started in 1926.
And that carried on until 1960, and then it started up again.
Yes.
And why did it start up again?
Well, that's a very interesting question, which I looked into a little bit and speculated upon, with some information, some good information about why it happened. In January of 1952, Ernest Cleveland, he was the commissioner of the watersheds. He was in charge to protect the policy of the watersheds, which said that there would be no industrial logging in the watersheds. And he was the commissioner for 26 years. And he very carefully maintained that policy and fought off requests by the forest industry to go in and log. In fact, the industry had been doing that quite often. But shortly after he died, it was a month later that a consulting forester approached the water district with proposals to start logging in the watersheds. He said that you know, it's a strong possibility that a fire could start in here, and which could ruin the quality of the water. And of course, the commissioner at that time said that was bogus, and because over the last 30 years they only had 3 very small wildfires started from lightning. Very small areas had been done. So he was trying to create emotional argument about to start logging in the watersheds.
Those are the arguments that we're still using. You recently did a critique on the GVRD's management booklet.
Yes.
And I'd like to get into that a little bit, Will, because that explains, I'll just bring up the points and you can elaborate for the public, perhaps people that aren't aware, what is happening in the watershed and what some of the issues are. The GVRD should be the guardians. They should be our guardians of the watershed. Is this happening, or who are the true guardians of the watershed?
Well, they're entrusted to look at the watershed lands, which is the public's trust or heritage. And they're ultimately responsible for any actions that go on in the watersheds. And getting into the watershed management booklet, what the booklet is, it's a 20-page glossy booklet, which was done which is done by the communications department, but headed by the watershed management department, which is the forestry department there. And they wrote the book to engineer their own viewpoints to have logging continue in the watersheds. Now, this is all part of a process to do with something called the ecological inventory. The ecological inventory is something which the consultants, some consultants are doing to look at the watersheds to see how they should manage the watersheds. And that impetus came from a public review in 1991, which called for an ecological inventory, because in the past 30 years, they had been logging the watersheds without any kind of scientific rationale. And so what this panel did on this review, they suggested that they have an ecological inventory. Now, the panel, which I mentioned in my critique, misinforming the public, about the watershed management booklet, they were
well, they brought up the issue about logging and roads and that kind of thing, right? And it's sort of along, you were saying, it goes along with the idea that the forestry is necessary to protect the watershed?
Yes. The panel which recommended that the ecological inventory be done, they were quite biased in the direction of having logging continue. In fact, they made a very big assumption, saying that logging, road building, and clear-cut logging wasn't contributing to the degradation of water quality. And they really had no scientific basis to say that. But everything that has happened subsequent to that is based upon that assumption. And so right now they want to continue with road building and clear-cut logging in the watersheds. And this watershed management booklet is something that the watershed management department wants to have before the public so that they can have some kind of backing to continue logging in the watersheds.
Now, logging in the watershed causes problems, you're saying. Logging causes grooves in the mountains and gullies and channels, and what are the results of that, the negative results for the watershed?
Well, there's been all sorts of very important studies done in the science of forest hydrology, which examines what happens with the water runoff because of roads which have been built in clear-cut logging and how these two things interact. And the studies show that there are very negative effects with sedimentation, sediments coming into down the stream courses and into the reservoir. There's also been a few very good studies done on the impacts of forestry management on reservoirs themselves. That is, each one of our watersheds, the Capilano, the Seymour, Coquitlam, each has a reservoir, and and professionals know that reservoirs do build up with sediments and will naturally fill up over the years.
So are they losing their holding capacities? Is that what you're saying?
The rate at which the sedimentation is coming into the reservoirs has been accelerated, I believe, from logging practices.
So the reservoirs are holding less water now?
I think so.
Yeah.
There was a very important study just done recently in Portland's watershed, which is the Bull Run watershed, where they did some core sampling, looking at the sedimentation rates, because the logging had happened in their watershed as well, under some very spurious reasons by the United States Forest Service. And people had suggested that they analyze their reservoirs to see what the sedimentation loading is, to see if there's a relationship with logging or not. And they came up with a very interesting conclusion that they think that it has been, it is a result of logging.
Right. Another thing you mentioned is the quality of the soil in the watershed. It's a very fine silt.
Well, the glacial deposits, most of which occur, which are seen in the Capilano reservoir area, and back into the watershed themselves, is very thick deposits of clay silt. And the recent landslide, there was most of that debris that went to the reservoirs is fine clay silt. And what happens is that when it gets released, it stays in suspension in the water for countless hours. And this affects the quality of our water, which is called turbidity.
So if there weren't a lot of clear cuts in the watershed, we would have trees holding the soil, the fine soil, and we wouldn't have the buildup of sediment, and i.e. we would have larger holding reservoirs and less problems with the water. So it comes back to the logging. Is it greed that motivates? I mean, the logging companies are saying that, this is to help the watershed, and in fact, history and all of that has proven that that is not so. So does it come down to the fact that there is lucrative timber in the watershed?
Oh, definitely. There's a lot of old growth forest, rare old growth in the watersheds. It's very rare now to find that type of timber anywhere in the province, really. And it's becoming more rare. So there's
anywhere in the world.
Well, definitely,
yeah.
Especially the rainforest, the timber rainforest, which we have.
Yeah.
Certainly, the industry has a vested interest to try to continue with the propaganda program for logging in our watersheds, because as they've argued during the public debate in 1991, that if logging ceases here, it will cease in, let's say, anywhere up to 600 other watersheds in the province.
And that's a lot of money lost.
It is.
Economically, that's a lot of bucks.
But you have to look at the other end of this thing as well. Is that what is a long-term cost to the residents?
Exactly.
Who
water is life.
That's correct.
Yeah. And we were chatting actually before the show about the wars of the future, and it's predicted that the wars of the future in the 21st century are going to be fought over water.
Well, there was an interesting report that just came out by the World Bank, and they mentioned that the most important issue for the 21st century will be water. And it's probably in the public's best interest to make sure that we have the highest quality water around, because it's going to be something of great demand, a commodity of great demand.
It's already started, Will, in third world countries. Many countries are turning into deserts, and then if global warming happens, as it's predicted, the water will be in even greater shortage. So,
well, it's interesting you bring up the subject of global warming, because let's say, for instance, that we're going to have an increase in rainfall because of global warming here locally. Now, what's the effect going to be on roads that are in our watersheds and clear-cut areas? They're only going to accelerate erosive processes. So in that sense, I mean, we could be in a lot of trouble.
We could be in a lot of trouble.
Given that scenario.
That's right. Talking about the roads, now there's a lot of maintenance involved in the roads in the watershed, which you say are not necessary. If it wasn't for the logging, they wouldn't be there. And who pays for this? Who pays for the upkeep and maintenance?
Well, theoretically, the maintenance costs were going to be handled by logging in the watersheds. It was going to be a
logging companies.
Originally, this was a tree farm.
Right.
So there would be sustained logging in the watersheds, a yearly cut, and those profits would handle maintenance as well as other things, forestry staff, the payment of the department over there. So now, because there isn't any logging, we, the taxpayers, are having to pay the brunt for maintenance of these roads.
That are virtually useless. I'd like to talk a bit about natural occurrences, and you know, historically we've heard from the logging companies and from the GVRD and other sources that a lot of the problem with the water, you know, the public says, well, what's wrong with the water? It's not the way it used to be, and why do we have to add more chlorine and this kind of thing? And we always hear, well, it's, you know, nature, it's fires, it's insects. When in fact, again, taking from your document, you say that old growth trees are less subject to fires. And I think the forest companies have planted 4,000 hectares of new young trees, which are subject, or are fire, what's the word that I'm looking for?
Well,
which are fire...
that's right.
They track fires.
That's correct. The big argument by, originally, like in the 1950s, which I mentioned briefly, and even now, is that they have to log because of the threat of fire. Right. Now, there's been studies done by forest science researchers which conclude that these young plantations are a greater source of fire than the old growth. And so that actually just spoils their argument about that. Actually, what they've done is, over the last 30 years, they've cut about just over 4,000 hectares of land. And these areas have a higher fire rating now than the old growth forests, which they were trying to remove.
So there's the proof.
It seems to point in that direction, yes.
It seems to. Chlorine, too. One of the reasons for introducing chlorine, was it not the introduction of people and machinery and that into the watershed?
Well, if you examine the chlorine rates before logging began and the chlorine rates many years later, you'll find that there's a significant difference in those rates. Mm-hmm. Those rates are also substantiated by chlorine rates even in Portland's watershed as well. Prior to logging and after logging as well, the rates increased many times.
So if there wasn't that much activity in the watershed, we would not need all the chlorine, and we'd have nicer water to drink.
I think so.
Yeah. There's also, I've heard about tours into the watershed. I know that schools are taking it on field trips. There were talks about recreational activities in the watershed. Is this going to happen?
Well, the tours for schools and whatnot were begun in the Seymour Demonstration Forest. They have their own kind of educational program. It's a forest industry propaganda program to educate people in the means of having forestry within the watersheds. And recently, because of all the attention on the watersheds, the Forestry Management Department decided to have public tours in the watersheds. And these tours are very carefully controlled. They're only shown certain things and told certain things and not other things. And so it's a way to try to get the masses to see that their past practices have been all right and manageable and are actually good for the watersheds.
Yes, as I say, it's always been said that, you know, all of the problems have been natural occurrences, fires, insects, slides, that kind of thing. But they've been emphasized, whereas logging practices have not really been looked at. Do you see this happening, and how about, in this connection, how about public access to the watershed, public process? Let's start with, let's start with access. Do we have open access to the watersheds?
On September 29th, the GVRD board, that is the meeting of all the mayors in the Greater Vancouver Greater Vancouver area, met to discuss this specific issue, and they started to open the door for public interest groups to monitor things within the watersheds. And just recently I wrote a letter for the last GVRD board meeting, which was actually yesterday. And I raised 3 things in my letter. One is to look at the recent landslide site, which they agreed to. And the other proposal was for me to get into the watersheds regarding my research, to writing a book on the history of the watersheds, which they never looked at. And the third one was a proposal I had for them to have a independent and authorized body of people to be able to go into the watersheds at any given point to document things that go on in there, and they would be publicly accountable for what's going on in the watersheds. So, and that issue was never raised as well, even though I had written them about it. So I need to get back to talk to them about it. But I think it's very critical for that process to happen, because it will give an element of trust and people to actually scrutinize what's going on in the watersheds.
So are people allowed to go in and scrutinize?
No, they're not without consent, and there's
limited access.
There's very good reasons for that.
Yeah.
You do need to protect the area, but there's also a contradiction in that as well because of the management practices that have been going on in the past. They've been going in there with heavy machinery. They've started fires in the watersheds because of logging activities, and also there was a recent helicopter crash from helicopter logging in there, and they had 4,000 liters or whatever of highly flammable fuel for the helicopter in there. So, I mean, there's some contradictions in what's going on.
How about the future plans for the watershed? What will happen? What do you see happening?
Well,
the
the present politics is that they want to see a continuance of logging and road building in the watersheds. Now, I don't think that's a wise choice at all. I think that in the long range we have to start putting our roads to bed, that filling up the natural contours. So that's, I think that's a long-term issue. And the next is in some of the plantations which they've made over the years, up to 1985, they had a single species plantation that's just Douglas fir, and they had been taking out a mixed forest and just replacing with Douglas fir. I think some of those trees need to be taken out and replaced with other species as well. So I think those are 2 important things that need to be done. And the third is to get an assessment of our reservoirs. That is, do a good study, and there's very interesting technology that can do that without taking core sampling in our reservoirs.
Right. How much of the trees, what percentage perhaps of the trees in the reservoir have been lost, say, to natural sources versus slash burning?
Lost? You mean that have just
the percentage, yeah. I know this percentage. The reason I'm asking you this, I know the percentage that have been lost to slash burning is quite high.
Oh, I see, right. It's in that report I did, right. There was about 85 hectares of area that were burnt because of forest management practices. That's from 1961 to 1991, whereas there were about 5 hectares lost to lightning fire. But if you look at the entire century, and look at the fires that have happened because of what the Capilano Timber Company did and other companies, is that statistic just jumps right through the roof.
Right, with fires.
There's no question that lightning has, in this century, has had little effect to forest fires in the watersheds.
Yet that's constantly brought up. It's natural reasons. What if logging continues, and with these numbers, these percentages that you're giving me, one thing that comes to my mind is wildlife habitat. How is that affected? With slash burning and the clear cutting?
Well, there was a recent study done into the spotted owl, for instance. There's many other species in the watersheds, but the focus has been on the spotted owl. That issue was very carefully controlled by the Watershed Management Department. They sent a representative over it was a team which was discussing this issue. And we really didn't have any knowledge about his involvement in that. And they were making decisions, their own decisions, without getting the public involved in this, and bringing these recommendations to the Water Committee. The Water Committees are the people who are responsible for discussing issues in the watersheds and reporting to the GVRD board. And it's so that process was very carefully handled by the Forestry Department.
And I imagine there are many, many species and many wildlife that are just...
Well, the watersheds are a very special place, and people really don't understand what's in the watersheds. There are many species in there that are right now in a protected state. And there's a dual function here, or many functions. Not only do we get our water from there, but they can also be a sanctuary for all kinds of wildlife and plants and the forest. And they also contribute to our local climate as well. There's a microclimate if you keep the forest intact. And
absolutely.
All that kind of. So there's a variety of things that are going on in the watersheds.
Yeah. So there are many reasons to keep them intact in their natural state.
Very many reasons.
How about getting back to public process and the average person? As I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the show, that the average person is very concerned for the future of their children, for themselves, with the quality of our water, which is deteriorating quickly. What can they do? How can they really get involved and make a change?
Well, this is a very important feature, a problem of which hasn't been responsibly held by the GVRD. In 1991, when the public review process was happening, they mentioned that the public could get involved in this ecological inventory, which I mentioned. And it was about a year ago that they tried to obfuscate this process by saying there wasn't enough money available, and that a water advisory committee, which has been dedicated to acting on behalf of the public since about 1992, were to handle this situation. And I protested in a letter about this. I was trying to monitor what was going on in this process. But I think it's very important that the public get fully involved in this issue, and that in fact the GVRD are trying very hard for that not to happen, I believe.
So people listening to this, if you're concerned about the water, get out there, write those letters, write to your politicians, get involved in committees.
Absolutely.
Read Will Koop's critiques and studies.
Well, I've done 4 things recently.
Yeah.
There's a draft manuscript that came out in 1993 called Wake Up Vancouver. It's about 150 pages. Right. There's a critique I did on the Chief Engineer's report on landslides. It came out last March. Then there's a history of the Coquitlam, which I did about a year and a half ago. And then there's the recent one, critique on the management booklet. And so hopefully 2 of those things are now available in the public library. I'll make the other 2 available shortly.
Great, that's wonderful, Will, and people should read them. They're eye-openers. Our time is up. Thank you very much for sharing this with us, and keep up the good work.
Okay.
I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Anderson's for providing this lovely setting for the interviews. For contact, I'm Gloria Creighton. Please join us next time.